You can start. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Hello and welcome. Thank you for taking your time to join us today in this webinar as we discuss about need for promoting arbitration in insurance in India. The panel consists of 4 luminaries, a former Chief Justice of High Court, a senior advocate, chairperson of an insurance company, and a financial sector specialist of international repute. Today is also a happy occasion for the participants of the second batch of Insurance Arbitration Certification course, which started 6 months back, as the webinar would be followed by the valediction and investiture ceremony where these participants would be conferred certificates as certified insurance arbitrators. I'm your host, Vandana Kannan. I'm also the course coordinator for the second batch of Insurance Arbitration Certificate course. Today's event is being organized and hosted by AIIRM, that is ASEAN Institute of Insurance and Risk Management. AIIRM is the education wing of ASEAN, Association of Social and Economic Advancement and Need, a not-for-profit NGO. AIIRM has been actively engaged in capacity building of the insurance industry in India since 2000 through insurance education, training, and consultancy. ASEAN Center for Dispute Resolution, or ACDR as we call it, is co-hosting the webinar and this valediction ceremony. ACDR, the Dispute Resolution Wing of ASEAN Arbitration Foundation, AAF, is also a not-for-profit Section 8 company and a sister organization of AIIRM. ACDR's aim is to help in the resolution of disputes related to insurance and other fields through arbitration, mediation, and conciliation in an amicable, quick, and inexpensive manner through online as well as offline modes. With this brief information, may I once again welcome you all. In order to start the program with a welcome address by Mr. K.B. Vijay Srinivas, I take this privilege to introduce Mr. Vijay Srinivas. Mr. K.B. Vijay Srinivas has recently retired as the Joint Additional Charge Chairman and Managing Director of United India Insurance Company. He is now the Director General of ACDR. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Vijay Srinivas.
Thank you, Mrs. Vandana Kannan. A very good evening to everybody. Due to technical hitches, there's been a small delay in commencement of the program. These things sometimes happen, we have to live with it. Distinguished panelists, members of AIIRM, members of ACD, certified insurance arbitrators, the first batch, and the second batch course participants, invitees to this webinar, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to everybody. As Mrs. Vandana Kannan was mentioning, this is an event hosted by AIIRM and ACDR. I'll give a brief this thing a little later. We have with us, unfortunately, I think he's still not been able to join. He'll be joining in due course. We have Honorable Justice Radhakrishnan, retired. Oh, he's coming.
Yeah, I'll come in. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, sir.
This is like reaching the court on time.
Yes.
Absolutely on time, sir. I was just taking your name to live up to 100 years. And I just took your name and there you are. And I take this opportunity to welcome Honorable Justice Radhakrishnan
Thank you.
with wishing him a very happy birthday.
Oh,
A day delayed, but it was on 29th of April, yesterday. And it's great that you're here with us today. Our joint wishes, collective wishes for many happy returns of the day. Justice Thottathil Bhaskaran Nair Radhakrishnan, former Chief Justice, Calcutta High Court, retired in 2019, laid down office in April 2019. He started his practice in 1983 in Trivandrum, later in Kochi High Court, and was appointed as a judge in Kerala High Court. And later, he was appointed Justice of Chhattisgarh High Court. And from there to Hyderabad High Court in July 2000. Then to Telangana High Court in January 2009. And then as Chief Justice of Calcutta High Court in April 2009. He was Chief Justice in Chhattisgarh, in Hyderabad High Court, in Telangana High Court, as well as in Calcutta High Court. A distinguished career. It's great to a big honor and privilege that you're here with us today to grace this occasion. We welcome you, sir, for this webinar. We have with us Dr. Rashmi, and I was looking at her profile. I used to pride myself as being highly educated, and I feel that I'm sort of semi-educated, if not illiterate, when I look at her qualifications. She has done her MBBS, later MD, and then moved on to MBA in finance, done LLB, and has done her PhD also. Have I missed out, ma'am? I hope not. So it's a very wide-ranging, moving from one profession to a second to a third, and it's something amazing, an amazing profile altogether. She is the executive chairperson of Retd Enterprises. It's a holding company for the Retd group of companies. She is chairperson of Retd Finvest and non-executive chairperson of Care Insurance and also insurance broking services. She also is into social activities. She's a medical advisor outreach to Sir Gangaram Hospital in Delhi, as well as Coleman Gangaram Hospital in Delhi. She has also started a hospital, Chandiwala Medical Institute in Delhi. So, a doctor, an entrepreneur, and also a person in social causes. I'm sure we'll have to learn from you. Welcome you, ma'am, for this program. We have with us Mr. Ramesh Singh, a senior at the Supreme Court. He is an expert in commercial litigation, has also in the field of arbitration, both domestic and international, company law, taxation. He practices in the Supreme Court, Delhi High Court, NCLAT, NCLT, tax tribunals, and so on. He is also headed Delhi government legal team for over 3.5 years. Welcome you, sir, today for this webinar. We have with us Dr. Arup Chatterji. He is Principal Financial Sector Specialist at Asian Development Bank, Manila. He was earlier at Bank for International Development, Switzerland. He was in IRD as well as in the Ministry of Finance, and has moved on to AIIRM now. He is an alumnus of IIFT, Institute of Foreign Trade, JNU, and he has done specialized courses from NYU Business, Cambridge, and Monash Universities. He is a blogger, a writer, and has contributed articles to various journals. Of course, I've had the I have had occasion to listen to him at various other webinars, and he would gaining a lot from his experience across the sectors. Welcome you, sir, to this webinar. The entire team of AIIRM and ACDR, I take this opportunity to welcome, and also all the invitees and participants who have come for this webinar. Briefly about the AIIRM. This was started a couple of decades back. A few executives sitting at retired executive insurance companies got together with this idea, and under the stewardship of Masood Wahab and small band, this institution, and has been running courses insurance and also MBA courses from Jamdard, Hamdard University. This particular arbitration, what happened was when lockdown came, all the offline courses were out. So there was a discussion what is to be done, and it was thought that why not have a webinar on certain select subjects. And arbitration was chosen as one of the areas because insurance, there are a lot of disputes and there are a lot of issues with insurance arbitration. So the focus was on insurance arbitration. So the first webinar was held sometime immediately after the lockdown. And looking at the response, there were a series of other arbitrations. And this led to the idea as to why create a panel of insurance arbitrators. And that's how this thing came up. And two batches. The first batch had completed some February, 6 months course. And now the second batch is completed course today. And almost close to about 60 they certified as insurance arbitrators. And then the next step, there I should bring in the name of Mr. Thottathil, Dr. Mallikarjun, who along and Masood, others, who together came up with the idea of creating a center for arbitration. And that is how this center, Asian Center for Dispute Resolution, has come up with alternate dispute measure. And it's in its initial stages, absolutely newborn baby. We had a small seminar in Kolkata last week, where on Justice K.J. Singh, former Chief Justice of Andhra and Telangana High Court, he inaugurated the session along, and there were a panel of senior advocates from Supreme Court and High Court. So with that, this is logical that it should come here. I was just reminded of a small poem. मैं अकेला चला था जानिब ए मंजिल मगर लोग साथ आते गए और कारवां बढ़ा. So, literal this thing, a small rough translation would be that I started with an idea, moving to my goal, and as I progressed, people started joining me, and soon it was a big caravan, big flock that joined together. So this also started with a small idea that why not have a webinar on arbitration, and as things progress, new areas have come up, and are moving on to other areas. So a big welcome once again to everybody present here, especially to the distinguished panelists and all the participants who are. Thank you very much, and I'm sure we will have a lot to learn. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Mallikarjun.
Thank you very much, sir. So let me also extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished guests, Justice Thottathil Radhakrishnan, Dr. Rashmi Saluja, Shri Ramesh Singh, and Shri Arup Chatterji. So let me just try to place this webinar in the context. So we've understood about the AIIRM taking up insurance education, but I would like to bring in a small context to the webinar so that we can have discussions around this. Insurance inclusion is something which we've been attempting, talking about and thinking of for a very long time. So the determinants for enabling insurance inclusion are first, post-liberalization, we have moved from the public sector insurers to private sector insurers. Then we have an independent insurance regulator in the form of Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority of India. Then we have a lot of intermediaries who have come into the business. And then from the availability of insurance in the form of service providers and distribution channels and the wide range of products that are there, we are there. The second part of it is in terms of building awareness so that the need of insurance is felt rather than being pushed or shoved down the throats of people. So from that point of view, we have made some progress individually through the regulator, independently through the insurers, and parallelly also through the NCFA, the National Center for Financial Education, where all the regulators in the financial system have come together. The next step is, in spite of these two efforts being there, we have seen that the insurance inclusion or the penetration and the density, which are the measures of insurance inclusion, have not risen in the manner in which we've expected them to grow. So it is only insurance penetration moved from 2.71% to 4.2% of the GDP, and the insurance density, which is measured in the form of per capita insurance premium in US dollars, we have only moved from 11.5 to 17 over this 20-year journey that we have taken. So there is something amiss. And when we look at the most important thing that is missing in this whole exercise is the insurance is basically a promise, and claim is a time when the promise comes into play. And it is there that we find that there are a lot of grievances, and these grievances need an elaborate mechanism of redressal. So while we have a regulatory framework in terms of an internal grievance redressal, we have an alternate grievance redressal in the form of an insurance ombudsman. In spite of these two things being there, we find, and IRDA also steps in by providing a mechanism where the grievances can be aired. There is a regulation through policyholder protection, etc. But in spite of it, I would just like to give a gist about the volume of grievances that we have, especially in the non-life, where there is a need for arbitration to be evolving as a mechanism of grievance redressal. We have about 50,000 complaints in the non-life space, of which about 65% of them relate to claim-related complaints. And when we go to the claim-related complaints, we find that those complaints which are not redressed in the complainant's favor, they are about 15,000 complaints. Then the insurance ombudsman offices handle about 2,000 to 3,000 complaints, and there they issue an award, etc. But in spite of that, the volume of complaints that are there is huge, and it is trying to create a kind of pressure on the policyholders because they don't have the trust. And IRDA recognizes this problem, and there is an arbitration clause provided But the arbitration clause only provides for a quantum disputes being taken for arbitration, but not the other ones. So in this context, our efforts have been in terms of expanding the scope of arbitration, and we would like to have the judiciary's approach towards arbitration, because these days everyone, right from the Chief Justice to everyone, is talking about arbitration and mediation. We need to get a judicial perspective to it. The second part of it is there is a huge buildup of complaints and grievances, and also the activity in the health insurance space which has come about after the COVID. So we need to see, and there is an arbitration clause which is provided in the general policies relating to health also. Is there any scope for looking at arbitration there? Then we know the experience in our country, but what is the experience internationally, for which we would like to get some learnings from our international expert? And more importantly, the finality is something which we are looking at, and what is the experience of a practitioner in insurance? We would like to get some view from the advocates who are operating in this domain in terms of the effectiveness of arbitration and the finality that comes out of these disputes. So this will be the broad context in which we would have the discussions. So first, let me just shoot a question to our learned Justice Radhakrishnan. So there has been an evolution of law in arbitration.
Doctor,
yes.
Can I just, my mistake, I should have introduced Dr. Mallikarjun to the panelists, a brief introduction to him. Dr. Mallikarjun is an academician. He's teaching law, insurance, and other subjects in Delhi. He has worked with two regulators, with Reserve Bank of India, and later moved on to Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority. He worked there also. And both the places he has, after working for some years, he decided to move into academics. And he's a PhD from the National Law School, a certified associate of the IIB, Indian Institute of Banking, and also a fellow of the, in both, there are two streams in insurance from the Insurance Institute of India. One is life and the other is non-life. So he's a fellow in both life and non-life of the Insurance Institute of India. And he is totally dedicated to academics and focused on law and insurance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So may I repeat the question? So there has been a lot of change in the arbitration law, and the law has evolved over the period of time with several amendments coming up after 2015. So Justice Radhakrishnan, I would like to get your views about the views of judiciary and the evolving role of judiciary in terms of evolution of the arbitration law of India. Could you share a few thoughts with us, sir? So you're mute, sir. You can unmute yourself.
Now I'm audible, I suppose.
Yes.
It's, see, I was just recollecting for myself that when I joined the bar in 1983, coming out of the Bangalore University, maybe the first case which I handled itself was in arbitration law. And initially, I was pumped into the sector of contracts and arbitration at the trial site. That is where, when the daily fight used to be in Section 20, Section 33, 32, and all those things, 30, under the 1940 Act. But having run through the mill right from those days down to 2021, when I retired as Chief Justice of the Calcutta High Court, and having gone through 5 high courts by the time, what I find, even today, what I heard is the complaint of backlog, the complaint of accumulation of undecided cases, the number of litigations that is causing concern. And we are trying to find out whether arbitration is an alternative mode. I think if this mindset is changed, and if you focus on saying that arbitration is qualitatively more productive rather than quantitatively, more statistically better, I think that is the thumb rule that should be pushed forward. And I'm sure people like Mr. Ramesh Singh, who really should be knowing that the qualitative output from the arbitration tables in many sectors sometimes really go awry, because I've had the opportunity of being a practitioner as a lawyer in litigations dealing with maybe a lot of matters of the various types of arbitrations. Of course, a lawyer is or a practicing advocate is supposed to be a jack of all trades, which we have to be. But then we have our limitations. Whenever we talk of areas, in fact, I was wondering, I was just hearing what the Honorable Chief Justice of India was mentioning this morning in the Chief Justice's conference. It was aired on AIR. And I was wondering, if I was born in 1959, we had a high court at the tip of India, from where I hail. That is the old state of Travancore. And the Travancore had what's called a Travancore High Court. And one of the Chief Justices of that High Court was demitting office on superannuation. And his farewell speech those days reflected on the pending areas of litigations. If that was the state of those days, what is the state of these days? Therefore, if we try this arbitration, mediation, conciliation, judicial settlement among the ADR modes as only siphoning off the area problems and easing the litigation sphere, I think people are not going to really take it, because you want qualitative output even in litigation management. I say this because before coming to what the judiciary has as certain problems, I will point out that choosing the arbitrators, of course, A and B have to agree as to whether C has to be an arbitrator. But at the end of the day, if C is unable or C is not a person who can deliver goods, if there is an application under Section 20 under the earlier Act, or under the present Act, where an application or a request is made to the Chief Justice of the State High Court for a national level arbitration or for an international arbitration before the CGI. And if a pick and choose is made exclusively to people who are presumed or assumed to be capable of being arbitrators, either by reason of their experience on the judicial side or otherwise, I think notwithstanding the statutory empowerment that the arbitrator may appoint experts to support, I think the adjudicating process, the qualitative wise. So the aim should be a qualitative, I would say a qualitative regeneration of the adjudication process on the arbitration table. This will necessarily immediately take me to the question that is now raised by Dr. Mallikarjun as to what is the judiciary's perspective and what will be the role. Now, this again, I will roll back to my initial days at the bar. We had visualized or we had understood as youngsters that this arbitration is nothing but one of the tributaries running from a large zone of litigation, channelized through the arbitration channel, going to the arbitrator, coming back again to the same subordinate judge or the senior civil judge rank officer, who is to hear an application to set aside an award or to confirm an award and pass a decree thereof. What is the qualitative? I'm only saying that what is the qualitative competence of that gentleman to decide or that person to decide, unless he adheres himself completely to the statutory norms. This is where we have a failure in the judicial system. When you have set judicial grounds, when you have set statutory grounds to set aside an award, and of course, with all the legal acumen that the lawyers have at the bar, had also been a practicing advocate, well, ingenuity will necessarily create more grounds. But nonetheless, unless the judges are able to fine-tune and make the forum have set rules of practice, I'm sure that the time-consuming ordeal of the civil courts, which is an oft-quoted reason why a resort to arbitration should be made, is necessarily not an answer for taking recourse to arbitration. Because I have personally appeared in matters where arbitrations 2 decades, 3 decades have rent the table. We are not talking about the arbitrations on partition suits. We're talking about arbitrations fundamentally which have a commercial content. So this is why I always why we now only have thought about this commercial litigations to be taken to the arbitration table. It had always been there. Now the establishment of the commercial courts, the commercial divisions in the high courts, and the concentration of the commercial division being overloaded by challenge to the arbitration awards and the appeals therefrom. We can understand exclusion of appeals by a statutory rule need not necessarily result in rendering of justice. So in some given cases, at least there can be miscarriage of justice. Let the rules be there. But then on whom does the responsibility lie? I would say that it squarely lies on the judicial officers, the judges who preside the offices. The large-scale arrear management is to be done by the judges. Under the 1996 Act, the grounds on which an arbitration award can be set aside are clear and specific. But if I were to scan the judicial orders coming out from the different courts in India as a whole, and through the high courts, and culminating in some judgments of the Supreme Court, we will find that there's so much of variation in the norms and understanding of the grounds by the judges who are deciding those matters. So, lack of certainty in such matters, in commercial arbitration, is something which have to be addressed. I had often been suggesting on the national table of our judicial side that training the judges, it is not training, at least provide them the opportunity to learn, so that you have an institutional consistency on set norms which are understood in the backdrop of the Constitution. So therefore, the judiciary, in fact, the role of the judiciary, I will just give you one small example. In one of the states through which I had graced during my career, I found that under the 1996 Act, the arbitration awards are put for execution before the principal civil court of original jurisdiction. This is how the Indian law works. Principal civil court of original jurisdiction is given the authority to execute the awards. And in one state, I found that the law was so understood that the principal district judge of original principal civil judge of original jurisdiction means only the principal district judge. And as the Chief Justice, I found that one courtroom in one district, in every district, was so overcrowded that the judge was not able to do anything there at all. Why? Because there was a whole misunderstanding and misapplication of the law by the jurisdictional high courts. Obviously, that had to be taken to a larger quorum, and that has been settled. Now the work gets distributed to 5 or 6 officers in one district. So I personally feel that the judiciary, in modulating its role, should not keep itself away from discussing such issues with the bar. I don't find it's a matter which is to be just kept off from the bar, from giving reasonable inputs for judicial management. And proper court management necessarily requires inputs from the different stakeholders who are getting involved in the institution. I'm sure that when it comes to commerce and trade, there are organized sectors, there are well-informed institutions which can also address the problems. And if the judiciary takes stock of all those things, I think we are trying to clog the system with excuses. If we try to disseminate the problems, get it out and go forward, then necessarily, if you understand the different provisions which have now been brought, at least in 1996 Act, in a way, without forgetting the objects ought to be achieved by the enactments. And if each judicial officer dealing with such matters have the mindset, the officers should have the mindset. When I mean the word officer, please take it from me, I mean everybody from the top to the bottom, from the Supreme Court down to the senior division civil judge. The mindset, objects and reasons of a statute should not be simply in papers. It should be with the mindset of the judges who decide and preside and ultimately give the verdict. Because timely judgments, timely justice are all things which we are speaking in different platforms. But if you take a personal responsibility to ensure that it happens, I think the judicial system can push it through. Thank you. I'll join for any other queries that will be raised. Thank you so much.
Very much, sir. Set the context, and we have referred to the stakeholders. So now let us come to one of the stakeholders, which is an advocate who would be representing the clients either before a judicial forum or before the arbitrator. So Mr. Ramesh Singh, let me just let me welcome you and also put this question to you about how do you see the role of arbitration and commercial dispute resolution in your experience of practice?
Thank you very much for putting that question to me. I'll try and answer this query. Let me break it down into two parts. I'm going to answer this question by looking forward. I quietly agree with Justice Radhakrishnan, his experience and what has happened in the past. Because today we are debating, we're trying to understand the benefit, because we are trying to tell people, please go for arbitration at this forum. So I'm going to answer this question as I said, looking forward with one. Number two, I'll divide my whatever I'm going to present in two silos. And these are the two silos, which is one pre-award stage, that is what happens before an arbitration tribunal. And second, post-award stage, what happens in the court, which is reviewing the award of an arbitration tribunal. Because ultimately, it's two silos, which together has to be looked into. But that's where the end comes, by the end of the second silo. If there's a problem in the first silo, there's a problem in the whole proceedings. And if there's a problem in the second silo, there's a problem in the whole proceeding. So we have to debate and we have to look into both the silos. Having said that, so therefore, let me first get into the first part. That is about the initiation of the arbitration itself. And you had correctly said commercial dispute resolution. Now, commercial dispute resolution, we are looking at two people of commerce. Two people into business. If two people into commerce and business are there, as their business, they want certainty, they want swiftness and efficiency in the dispute resolution. And therefore, they're going to go one step forward. They're going to go out, they're ready to go out of the court and have a private dispute mechanism. And that's exactly what the arbitration is all about. Now, speediness and efficiency is what they're looking at, and that's what I believe an arbitration does seem to have provided. I'm going to indicate not with that past experience, but also starting from this amendment in 2015, because in arbitration, a lot of happened after 2015. With the amendment and how things have happened after the amendment, it perhaps has made things very efficient. Of course, efficient more than before 2015, prior to what was there in 2015. Now, first part what happens is when I want to start a dispute, I want to have a forum. Now, the best part of an arbitration is that the parties who are in dispute, they are permitted to choose their tribunal. Now, once you're permitted to choose a tribunal, you know for the nature of dispute you are there, which is the best people suited to be there adjudicating the dispute. You can pick your own nominee, so you have that, that kind of comfort under the Act itself. If you're not in a position to pick your own nominee for whatever reasons, then the court picks up that arbitrator and forms a tribunal for you. And that's where the court first intervention comes in a Section 11 proceedings. Now, today's Section 11 proceedings that interfere, earlier Section 11 itself used to take a lot of time. So the constitution of a tribunal itself used to take a lot of time. With an amendment now in place, perhaps I've seen that it's taking less time, at least with my experience, most of my experiences in Delhi High Court and thereafter after Supreme Court. At least the Section 11 proceedings are getting disposed of very quickly. But even mostly after this amendment in 2015. We have two things happening. One, and when the High Court is deciding, they are also deciding looking at the quantum and the nature of dispute. So they are picking up a tribunal which is perhaps most suited to look at that particular dispute, which one may not have if you go to a normal civil court or original side rather than the High Court or a civil court. So one, if you go on your own, able to pick your tribunal because you know who is the best tribunal, or the court is helping you and efficiently and quickly helping you to do that. That's the first stage cross, which in my view is very important for any commercial dispute resolution for any stakeholder in a commercial dispute resolution mechanism. The next thing which comes is when the matter then goes before the tribunal, that their adjudication process and how efficient and how quickly is the whole process there. As I said, again, I will look at the mandate which is there after the amendment. We have a mandate which is coming where an arbitration award is supposed to be delivered within 12 months and with a default of another 6 months happening. This is Section 29A. It also provides, there's this kind of a check on the arbitrator. It's like a hanging sword on the arbitrator that if in case you're not able to do that, consequences will follow. Not just monetarily, but also as a reputation wise. So that does give a handle for, and that does speed up an arbitrator to do a matter far more efficiently than it could have been done earlier. And I'm seeing that also in practice. We also, I'm not just as a practitioner, also happen to act in few matters which is referred to me as an arbitrator. So we do, when we also sit an arbitrator, the section 29 is there on our head, so we try and work as quickly as possible. So this amendment is working, and I've experienced both as an arbitrator but as in the court, because when an application is filed for an extension of time, questions are asked. It's not just granted as a matter of course. So therefore, there is a hanging sword. So this amendment has, in my whatever little I've seen, has worked to make the process smoother and faster. And then we have a fast track arbitration provision also now, which were not there earlier under section 29B. So that takes care of insofar the speed and alacrity of which an award can be delivered. And I think 12 months to 18 months is pretty good time to do that. And a businessman who actually ultimately, end of the day, we are all serving a client, a person with a commercial background who wants a dispute to be resolved as quickly as possible. So this is another thing which I believe, something which is good, something which now I'm seeing working. The third thing which is very important, which is in the Act about this whole commercial dispute efficiencies coming in, is a deterrence factor. When I say deterrence factor, what is very important, that a person, when there is a dispute, a person, if he has to go for the dispute or settle the dispute, is something which should hang in his mind before he gets into the whole exercise of going for an arbitration, and that's the deterrence. If there's enough deterrence under the Act, which is there, which I see is there and exercised properly in international arbitration, are two most important facets which I feel is, one is imposition of cost, and when I say cost, means realistic cost, and imposition of interest. And again, say interest is not it should be some realistic, good commercial interest. Now, these two things that we find now, which is very much there in an arbitration act. I also find that the arbitrators are looking at in a more realistic fashion. So now we do see an award which is happening where the interest is awarded in a very realistic commercial fashion. That's happening now. Second, the cost also realistic. Now, cost are actual cost incurred, of course, can't be very inflated, but you are getting a substantial cost. Now, with these two things coming, and this is only when you are going through an arbitration mechanism. And when I say arbitration mechanism, therefore you have to have an arbitration agreement to begin with. This again makes this whole process of commercial dispute resolution through arbitration an efficient mechanism, because this is something like the deterrent right at the beginning. So somebody who just wants to litigate, wants to delay, perhaps with these kind of provisions being there, it may not inure to his benefit, and therefore somebody may not like to go in arbitration and may like to settle the dispute. And this will only happen if you have an arbitration clause, because then that binds that person. The person knows I can't go to some other forum and delay. He has to go through an arbitration mechanism. And once he goes through an arbitration mechanism, he knows these are the deterrents. So on paper, this is what I believe is something which is happening, which is pretty good under the Act, which is happening. And I see, especially after 2015 amendment and some amendment in 2019, that things have speeded up. And this is where the first silo, what I wanted to present in the first silo ends, except for one thing, which is like a special mechanism for MSME, which we should also not forget. It's a pretty big backbone of a commercial work in this country. There's a micro, small, and medium enterprise. There are another statute, which we all know, MSME Act, which has its own special provision in arbitration, which is a very highly deterrent provision for somebody just to litigate against these small, medium enterprises. One is the interest is extremely high. It's not even as what we had in arbitration act. There the interest percentage is very high, which is provided in section 15 and 16 there. This is 2 times the RBR rate and 2.5 times to that extent. Number one. Number two, there when somebody challenges an award, there is a compulsory pre-deposit of 75% with no waiver. Now these two things are extremely big deterrent again. And of course, there are other set of dispute which is arisen in MSME. But having said that, these two provisions, of course, and again, this contemplates going to the arbitration through this mechanism. It's like a statutory arbitration in that sense. It gets kind of pulled in our Arbitration Act through Section 2.2. So this also is something which is again, this will only happen, and this of course an advantage which an MSME has by virtue of being an MSME. And even if they don't have an arbitration agreement, there is a statutory arbitration in the act. So this has its own benefit. Now, in my experience, then I come to the second silos. But then even in the first silos, even with this 12 months and 16 months and the quality, which I completely agree with Justice Radhakrishnan, we can't compromise the quality, but ultimately it's a dispensation of justice end of the day. You can't compromise on quality. With 12 months and 16 months, ultimately, but what the award comes out, how good the award comes out is an individual. On an individual, and therefore I'll go back before I end this first silo point to the appointment of an arbitrator. So therefore, that's where a role of a court. We do have in Delhi High Court, at least I've seen this experience that the people who are picked up for a given disputes are picked up looking at, yes, this person has a good track record, is efficient, does not, you have to give a disclosure, how many arbitration you are doing. So your diary is free. So you can move. So that's why the speed is there. With that disclosure, which is very important, that we will not, if you disclose more than few arbitration, then perhaps you'll have to recuse yourself from that arbitration. And the quality of the people are picked up who the judge or the party is coming directly without going to the court. He knows that, yes, this is the good people who can decide, the efficient people who have the domain expertise in this line of commercial dispute. That's picked up. And this can only happen in arbitration. So therefore, of course, individuals, it will depend ultimately, end of the day, the two individuals can't be same. And if two individuals can't be same, the quality and the quantity, that will differ here and there. But broadly, I said that broadly the mechanism does ensure that things are done efficiently, quickly, and in a swift manner. Now coming to the second silos, now we are going to the court. Once the award comes, is challenged in the court. Now I believe the biggest deterrent today, again, as I said, I can again speak with my experience in the court proceeding, which starts with a challenge, which is section 34. And my experience has been to bring the finality to this whole dispute. Once the award is there, it completely rests on the court who's hearing an appeal, how efficiently they are able to handle a section 34 petition. Now today, there is no automatic stay that era has gone after the amendment. So therefore, one will have to get a stay. Now here, that's where the section 34 courts comes in. If they're able to see through a matter, they look at it, and if the kind of stay, which is nature of stay order, which is granted, that brings in a great, to my view, a great help in giving an ultimate finality and a quick finality to an arbitration award. If unconditional stays are granted, then again the matter will just linger on and on. But if conditional stays, especially if full deposits are given, then the person who suffered an award will like a section 34 petition to be disposed of as early as possible because he's out of his pocket. Now, this is where a judge in 34 in the first hearing itself, even if you think this has to be decided, it has to be looked into. On this facet itself is very, very important how a section 34 court decides a stay application. But that will set the tone for the future. How the future ultimate finality to an award comes in the matter, because sometimes if you deposit, sometimes maybe those people want to settle because this again it becomes a big deterrent, giving the entire arbitral award to be deposited in the court. And of course, this is one thing which is there, which is being exercised very diligently. But if it's not exercised, as I said, this depends upon the judge. But the system is in place now. Something like this can be done. And this does make a lot of commercial sense, according to me. But if a High Court judge or a district judge, because there is no original side in the High Court, and that's where one problem comes in. The way a district judge looks at it may be slightly different than the way a High Court judge looks at it, which is experience and a commercial experience background. And of course, that also depends from the judges of which High Court and which High Court. Because again, we go back to the commercial, what commercial background a judge is coming from. What is his own experience, how he looks at commercially, what is his bend of mind. But then again, that's individual to individual. Of course, now international commercial arbitration, which is held in India, now with the statute, the matter goes to the High Court. But that same thing is not there in a domestic award. So that problem will be there. But then yes, and I completely agree with Justice Radhakrishnan that some sort of training has to be given to the judges who are hearing a commercial dispute, especially who comes in this roster. Perhaps maybe not at a high court level, but definitely at a district, because quite a few high courts don't have original jurisdiction. No matter even how high stakes of award, if an award given by a tribunal of 3 retired Supreme Court Chief Justice of Supreme Court will go to a district judge if there is no original jurisdiction there. So that training has to be given to those judges to how he handles a Section 36 stay application, and then of how swiftly he delivers a Section 34 petition. This again depends on the individual. But overall, my experience has been, at least my experience, of course, I can say, so somebody can say it's a very elitist experience because we get Delhi High Court. But then, yes, things are in the 34. In Delhi High Court, things have been moving very nice. We have a commercial wing. It's being taken very differently. And judges are pretty tuned to how they have to handle, how efficiently the whole dispute has to be brought to an end. And this can be done at this stage itself, which is being done here. So therefore, with this benefit, I perhaps feel that when you look at an insurance matter also, insurance matter, of course, with some kind of modification one needs to do to the insurance arbitration clause. And to have an independent panel itself, maybe an IRD or somebody can have an independent panel itself on arbitration. This perhaps could be, because see, you can have to encourage it. Because if somebody today, apart from IRD, wants to go to a consumer forum, which is today a chosen forum mostly, you can't stop that person even if there is an arbitration clause, because it is well settled now that even with an arbitration clause, a consumer dispute matter can go on. It's in addition to not in derogation. So you can't stop. So in consumer, you have to cajole them, because you can't stop them even if there is an arbitration. First, you have to change your arbitration agreement. Second, you have to make our arbitration under this insurance regime. The arbitration regime has to be made very efficient. It has to be made in a manner that people themselves are tempted to go for arbitration instead of going to a consumer court. So we have to inbuild all these advantages which are there in arbitration, starting from appointment of an arbitrator, and so that a person is, especially if you can't target a very small people, at least you can target a larger commercial dispute. We have in a service matter, larger in a service like insurance policy, which are in the service jurisdiction. You know, a commercial insurance matter comes to consumer courts. Then perhaps those people may be induced to go for arbitration if you can have and get all these advantages which an arbitration offers to you. That is all that I wanted to say for the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. You have given an overview about the efficiency of arbitration and your experience in relation to that. So now I would like to take it over to our financial sector specialist, Mr. Arup Kumar Chatterji, to find out what is the experience in respect of usage of arbitration internationally in insurance, because we have seen that there is a need for change. How is the position internationally? We would like to get a sense of it from you, sir.
Good evening, everyone, for this question. In terms of usage of arbitration in international dispute, I think arbitration is an indispensable of international commerce. And arbitration has long been popular in certain parts of the financial services sector, which includes insurance and reinsurance disputes. I will be limiting my observations on international financial transactions, and if we see the developments which are in the English and New York courts, it has traditionally been, litigation has traditionally been, I would say, the default option for most international lending and capital market transactions. Some time back, the University of London carried out a survey and it revealed that for the financial services sector, litigation still was the preferred mode, rather the most preferred mode, 82% versus 23% ranked for arbitration. So we have to think about arbitration in that context also. Of course, recent years have seen changes. Arbitration clauses have become increasingly common in financial transaction documents. Banks and other financial institutions, have they been converted? The answer appears to be quite subtle, maybe not a simple yes or no. It should therefore, no surprise, the switch to arbitration has been led by parties operating in emerging markets where there is often concern about cross-border enforcement of judgments. And therefore, we talk about the fulcrum of development having shifted to Asia, the fulcrum of the insurance market also having shifted to Asia. This becomes very, very important. When you look at Europe, it has an effective regional cross-border enforcement regime. They have the European Union's Brussels Regulation, the Lugano Convention. But in the Asia Pacific, when we don't such. Of course, there are bilateral arrangements for enforcing court judgments, but they are quite patchy. Singapore, for example, has arrangements with a number of countries: Australia, Hong Kong, India, Malaysia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and others. But if you see, it is rather like an outlier in the region. In contrast, if you see the New York Convention, where the contracting states need to enforce arbitral award subject only to limited grounds of refusing enforcement, which do not include a review of the merits, we see a better record than others in enforcing awards under the New York Convention. And perhaps when we talk of a global framework for enforcement of arbitral awards, New York Convention seems more acceptable in that sense. In the Asia Pacific region, almost all contracting states which have acceded to the New York Convention are basically contracting states. So they are, in terms of what you call, in terms of real countervailing power, they have a very little choice in that sense. In sometime around 2005, the Convention on Choice of Court Agreements was adopted under the auspices of the Hague Conference on Private International Law. And this convention is ambitious in terms of providing an effective global regime for enforcing judgments made pursuant to exclusive jurisdictional clauses. Today, when you see there are only a few states which are signatories, even after 8 years of passing out the first 8 years of passing after the passage of this agreement, there was only one state, Mexico, which signed. So what we call, if you talk about the Hague Convention's challenges vis-a-vis the New York Convention for global coverage, there still remains a lot of things which we need to untie in terms of. If you see the benefit of arbitration, I would like to speak a little bit on that. And one thing we need to emphasize is the expertise of the decision maker, which makes it beneficial in international arbitration especially. Expertise is ahead of enforceability and other commonly cited benefits of arbitration, such as neutrality, confidentiality, and flexibility. And in that sense, in the Asian region, the popularity of Singapore as an arbitration center for resolving regional dispute scarcely needs any elaboration. So any regional domestic party on one hand and foreign investor on the other would always choose Singapore as the obvious choice. And that trend has obviously developed around perceptions on each side of the home advantage and providing scope for enforcement of an award under the New York Convention in circumstances where domestic courts judgments can be difficult. And this trend is pertinent more to large-scale onshore and offshore construction projects. As you know, in Asia, there is a large infrastructure deficit which is about 459 billion US dollars. And we as a development bank, we are trying to crowd in private sector investment to make good or plug this infrastructure deficit gap. And therefore, there is a lot of merit in terms of promoting such arbitration related mechanisms for attracting foreign investment infrastructure for renewable energy and natural resource, now that we are talking about climate change in this sector. When we look at foreign trade, trade finance, marine cover becomes an obvious leading line of business for insurers here. We have references before the Singapore Chamber of Marine Arbitration, which has been on an upswing that way, due in part due to its refreshed rules. But there are also special problems, especially because of the clogged network of international maritime transport, and there have been a lot of disputes over collision and like that. So to conclude, I would say a combination of factors is driving the growth of financial sector arbitration. For a party doing business in Asia, enforcement risk will typically be reduced if it insists on an arbitration clause rather than an English or New York jurisdiction clause. Even if there are relevant bilateral judgments treaty in a deal with a counterparty with assets in multiple jurisdictions or multiple counterparties based in a variety of jurisdictions, arbitration will always provide the creditor with the option of enforcing against assets in several places. Of course, parties could simply litigate in local courts and avoid cross-border enforcement altogether, but levels of expertise, reliability, and efficiency of the courts vary considerably in the Asian region. Parties will often need to field specialist arbitrators who are better equipped to deal with disputes under complex financial transactions than the courts in many other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the perspective, sir. So now let me bring in Dr. Rashmi Saluja. Madam, we've had expert in health insurance. The importance of it has been recognized by the government, and there was a change that was brought in where health insurance has been incorporated as a definition in the Insurance Act itself. Then we have standalone health insurers coming in. And with COVID, there has been a spurt in terms of grievances relating to health insurance, and also there is an increased interest in health insurance. So in this context, could you just give us a sense about what is the level of grievances? Is the grievance redressal machinery tuned in terms of handling these grievances? And I would combine the next also by saying that is there scope for arbitration to be brought in as a mechanism of grievance redressal in health insurance? Madam, can we have you?
Thank you, Mr. Mallikarjun. First of all, thank you, the organizers, to organize such a relevant topic of discussion. And of course, insurance sector as such is a very important sector. And of course, the health insurance, which I would be talking about, is a sector which is absolutely cannot be ignored now. And let me just go back a little bit. In fact, when I would like to just concentrate and talk about how the health sector in India works. Health sector in India is still not an organized sector when you talk about as far as the healthcare providing services are concerned, because then there are tertiary care centers and there are district level centers, then there are individual doctors and so on and so forth. We are still evolving. And then of course pandemic happened and all of a sudden everything had a completely different orientation on how the health sector should be taken up. While India, in fact, has been one of the most important health givers since couple of 100 years, thousands of years, and they had huge documentation on how the practices of health sector should be done. And then all of a sudden, then it became a kitchen practice, and people did not consider it as one of the important pillars of any development of a society or a country and how it should be done. And even today also, in fact, the true reflection of GDP as it should be as far as the health budget is concerned is not the true reflection of how it is, the importance of it. And it still needs a lot of, in fact, thought process. But of course, it is evolving, and it has since last couple of years. It is much better and still not proportionate to the seriousness and the growth of the countries considered how it should be. In last 20 years, in fact, the health insurance part was, in fact, quite subdued. In fact, much more, of course, the motor insurance and the life insurance, a lot of other insurance aspects, of course, dealt about it. And health was just an emergency situation. People wouldn't budget for it. People wouldn't talk about it as, they would talk about their children's education, they'll talk about their marriage, but they wouldn't talk about the health part of it. Health was considered, taken for granted. And now all of a sudden you have to spend money on it. Now you need to avail the facilities, and how do you go about it? Of course, insurance and health insurance, and that is where the companies like ours, the standalone health insurance companies, and of course the other insurance companies which have been in existence for such a long time. So it used to be there as a product, but as a complete organized sector, it has recently seen a lot of developments happening. While it used to be just a document when you were traveling and the health insurance was mandatory, but it was a document and it had to be done because it was the requirement. Otherwise, people didn't actually even go through the document to see that what would be covered in that health insurance aspect. So till pandemic happened, it was only either a mandatory requirement by any particular agency, or it was an emergency setup. In that particular aspect, how would a country like ours with such a huge population talk about a very important pillar where still the GDP of the country and the health budget is not the true reflection of each other? Let's talk about as a pre-pandemic cause and the post-pandemic cause. The surge has become 257%, 3.5 times of what it used to be into 2020, and now that is the kind of the surge that has happened. All of a sudden, things have evolved from very nascent to extreme high end. All of a sudden, the infrastructures have developed. All of a sudden, the newer policies have been introduced now to cover most of them, and the awareness. And all of a sudden, in fact, I really feel that what should have been done as a process of evolution has happened overnight. Definitely, there were laws which need to be upgraded. There are laws which need to be made afresh to look at how the situations are beyond consumer forum and beyond the usual court of justice. Can we mimic or can we copy the same kind of health issues or the laws that have been there in the more developed and more advanced countries? I don't think so. So here is a situation which is totally indigenous to us. Here is a situation which is totally affecting the local population, where it cannot be comparable to any other, because that is how the progress of the health sector has happened in our country. And yet, it is an expensive sector. Yet, it is a situation where literally the economies of a household to a country is now going to be dependent upon. So now we need to realize that what needs to be done with extreme effectivity and the qualitative understanding of it, as Justice Radhakrishnan said, because this is a sector which is dependent on the ethical practices of hospitals, doctors, their understanding, the bridge of trust which happens between an insurer and an insurance company and an insurance provider and a regulator. All of us will have to evolve in a much faster pace to understand what are the requirements and how it can be resolved, if not completely, but to an extent where this trust and the growth of the healthcare insurance part of it and the healthcare sector should not get affected. Compared to a lot of other activities or other parts of the arbitration, it is a completely different understanding altogether. And here, the arbitrators have to be on a different level of understanding. The internship and to understand what goes in it. A doctor and a hospital will treat a patient in one hospital in one city will be totally different from as it could be in any other part of the country, as it could be in the district level. A similar kind of a problem with a fracture or an accident, somebody would actually just recommend an X-ray and somebody will recommend a CT and MR. The difference between 100 rupee and a 10,000 rupee investigation, how do you justify that? How can you say that my knowledge is not adequate enough to understand the diagnosis of a patient? And yet a patient is the sufferer between a doctor who is going to be prescribing him a particular way of treatment and a person who has to, or the organization or health insurance company who has to actually fund it. How does this kind of a situation be taken care of when I have to go and represent or my team has to go and represent? So everything looks fair actually. How do you decide what is a malpractice and what is the correct thing to have been done? Whether this has been a situation which has been talked about in the entire country, the negligence part is, where is the negligence part? End of the day, somebody will have to foot in the money. So who decides what? And definitely if it is not addressed well, the grievances are going to be disproportionately high in this country. The reason, in fact, the protocols are far better set because the equivalent technology and the equivalent level of protocols are there in the West. We are still evolving. And this is going to take, in fact, maybe more than a decade plus to actually reach to a situation where things are more systematically done. But there is a person who has absolutely is dependent on a Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana or Ayushman Bharat Yojana, or somebody who comes to a private insurer. Does the capability of doctors differ knowing what kind of a patient is there? No, his capabilities will only depend on where he is sitting, what kind of an instrumentation or mechanism he can be using or diagnosis that he can use for a particular patient. Now the pandemic happened. Why is that the awareness all of a sudden started becoming so much more better? People started actually going through the form of insurance, started reading that, started understanding, started planning their insurance. And once that awareness, and would you be surprised, the claim of the insurance is highest between 25 to 35 years of age group, where people are supposed to be healthy. But that's because that population is comparatively little more aware and more educated, and they know exactly what it is needed for them for next 10 years, 20 years, and the planning for their insurance and for the health is now becoming as good as planning their career, their future, and their education. Having said that, but the dilemma between the health insurance companies is that it needs to work and operate in an orbit created by a regulator. And then they have to do a back-end servicing and understanding as per a particular hospital works. And for sure, the customer is always correct. How do you actually create a balance by being in that regulated body, which has tried to improvise situations and yet to create some sort of a basic semblance where the grievances can go down. And end of the day, the entire thing is also based on the satisfaction of a patient, how well he's being treated in a particular hospital and how well his insurance part is being covered. Because he never planned before, it was just like a compulsory policy that he took. But now he is there admitted in a hospital and he wants to increase the claim policy or a particular product, which he needs to be done. The awareness of when he took that particular policy was not as high, but he all of a sudden gets pushed because it is hugely budgeted out of his budget. And then what really happens? Even if that is a particular situation, does the patient need to suffer? Is the hospital correct? How do you actually try and address this grievance of that particular patient? And that is where, in fact, the healthcare or the insurance arbitrator should be factoring in a much, much better way, because these are the things which cannot actually linger on for so long. This needs an absolute, a very urgent settlement. So as a company, as a health insurance company, which needs to be working in the present situation, would actually strongly recommend a well-certified, well-trained, well-interned arbitrator who understands this technical aspect. Unless and until this ecosystem is created, and it's not only that he understands the technical aspects of the medical part of it, but he should also understand the regulator and its laws. Unless and until that is to be understood, I don't think so. Actually going to any court. In fact, I have seen the cases keep on lingering, and it is a loss of the country, whichever way it is actually handled, whether a patient wins or a health insurance company wins, either which ways it's not a win-win situation. End of the day, we are wanting to penetrate the health insurance at the bottom of the pyramid. How would that happen? You can't keep on accumulating those cases to that level that it is really, really not going to see the light of the day for a couple of years. Unless and until this is in fact a fast track where a lot of things work on the trust factor, a lot of things works on very, very simple understanding of how the systems work in the healthcare sector. Unless and until that, I really, really feel most of it should be actually brought into it. Otherwise, the level of grievances are not going to come down. And a lot of it should be put into the awareness part of it. And unless all these parameters are actually put together, there will be a very difficult growth in a country where the pandemic is looming. And a huge amount of economy is dependent on this particular aspect. I have been talking about it, and I talked to a lot of, in fact, wherever, in fact, there are organizations like this, which is doing an extremely great work on actually creating a certificate course on the arbitration. I really feel the courses that you are going to be designing, it should be so much to understand the technical aspect of it, the empathy of it, the medical aspect of it, the regulatory aspect of it, and the insurance companies aspect of it so well, then only actually arbitration can lead somewhere. But let me tell you also one thing, with my experience of being a doctor and with my experience of running a health insurance company, the only way forward is the arbitration way. It has to be devised in a way that it understands the indigenous problems, and with a time-bound situation. Unless and until that is not going to happen, let me tell you one thing, any amount of schemes, any amount of goodwill of the government, any amount of the healthcare provider, it's not going to work. So you people, what you're doing is something which is going to make a success out of a healthcare industry and the health insurance. That's all, Mr. Mallikarjun.
Thank you very much, madam. In fact, we have a doctor, Dr. Satish, who is undergoing this program. He's working with Star Health and he's interested in understanding the nuances of arbitration as well as insurance, so that he can work towards redressing the grievances. So now, since we have tied up one round and we are short on time, I would get back to Justice Radhakrishnan with a simple question. So the emphasis is there, and it is understood that arbitration is the way forward, especially in relation to the most improving or the most important sector like insurance. The most important part that would now be important is the finality in relation to the arbitral award. So what do you think, sir, in terms of what are the mechanisms? Is the law sound enough in terms of ensuring that there is a finality to arbitral award, or as some people say, there has to be a separate cadre of judges who would be handling this so that they would be sensitive to the arbitration as a mechanism, and then a separate bar also so that they don't litigate, rather they go for arbitration so that there could be a finality. So where do you think could the finality to this come in? Otherwise, it would be a reiteration of the story that you have indicated, saying that we go through the consumer courts and land up in Supreme Court and it will go in for 20 years. We go through the arbitration, no finality, we'll probably land up for about 15 years, which could happen. So I would request you to throw some light on the finality aspect, because we now come to a conclusion that that's where the solution lies. You're on mute, sir. Sir, you're on mute, sir. Yes.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
See, shortage of time, I will just confine to a few aspects. Otherwise, I wanted to actually share one or two examples. Well, one issue that we need to focus is building a mindset among the people who are likely to go into this sort of a litigation. See, if I have a problem of conflict with the hospital or with the insurer, or a conflict between the insured and the insurer as well as the hospital, then we need to have a platform which is built fundamentally on confidence. This is very, very important. Very, very important. Just one sentence I will say about two litigations. One in which I was an advocate appearing for the party, and the other in which I was a judge adjudicating. I don't know whether those chemicals are now used at all. One was pitocin, which I think Dr. Rashmi will understand. Pitocin, which I think is, I've studied it for the purpose of the litigation. It is given to induce delivery. And that's the last situation that is being applied in some cases. The patient died ultimately because there was no attention. The question was whether a particular doctor at a particular level in the hierarchy ought to have been physically present after administering pitocin. Whatever had ultimately come out to the different issue. But the judge came from a zone totally ignorant of the field of science. And also with great respect to that officer, I couldn't, in spite of my very serious efforts, impress upon that officer as to what is this pitocin and what is this effect of pitocin, though I come from the stream of science. Notwithstanding that, fortunately, my client succeeded because the arguments went on a different way and we came out of the situation. Another issue is a recanalization of a failed tubectomy. Assume that it is covered by insurance. I know the history of that part of litigations. We have history of awards and decisions by courts, where in India, the courts have awarded compensation to bring up 2 or 3 children of a particular female where there is a recanalization. And assume that the insurance is boarded with that decree, where you say, okay, up to 18 years of education, healthcare, khana, pina, sona, sab kuch, you pay. Where are you going to end up? Does the see fundamentally working on Ubrimi doctrines in the field of insurance, and how do you really envisage the visualization of the insurance provider or the insured? This is no idea that should come up. So one thing which I wanted to focus, I thought Mr. Ramesh Singh could be provoked, at least by me, to speak on that. Section 30 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act of 1996. Section 30, which says about the availability of a room for the arbitrator to take recourse to settlement, mediation, as a modality, notwithstanding the arbitration clause. As one, because this finality, because one way of curtailing finality is, ensuring finality is to ensure that there is a last table on which the matter is going to be over. But in the meanwhile, like it was being suggested by Mr. Ramesh Singh, that if you have a modality of interlocutory orders being passed by the award challenging courts, the courts where the awards are challenged, you put pressure on parties to come to a reconciliation, come to a settlement. That's one way of doing it. But there is a provision which indicates that there is no exclusion of this sort of mediation, sit around the table, let them talk, try to find out. If arbitrators have a capability of generating in themselves a mindset to prompt and take the parties along with that, something like I would say a trained mediator would do, at least in the Delhi scenario, where I know that trained mediators do a wonderful job, because I also was leading the mediation in different states, and I know that the quality of the mediation output in the Delhi Mediation Center. Therefore, if you can have mediation as a, what do you call, something like a good sandwich along with arbitration in appropriate cases, not in all cases, particularly when, there's a human life issue or health issue sector, it's not merely a commercial bargain. There are so many other things which may go in. I think this is one thing that should be focused upon. And I would put my foot down and tell all my officers when I was in service that you are given a jurisdiction. Don't be cruel, but be wise to ensure that you have to just stand and do what you have to do and nothing more. Sometimes, the heart cannot run over and above the head. Sometimes these sort of things do happen in arbitration. Rate of interest simply drops in terms of section 34 CPC, drops it to 6%, simply because the judge does not know what Chief Justice Y.K. Sabarwal's judgment that repeatedly been pointing out at commercial litigations. See, this is the whole issue. And like it was being pointed out, the Delhi scenario is different from what I would focus from the Cochin scenario. So I think curtailing the hierarchy can be done efficiently if those in the, assume that the power of admission of appeals, which is a mandatory situation, along with the appeals, you have this interlocutories. If the judge is known, that this is how the judge's quality is reflected. 5 cases down the street, the judge is known as to what he will do in type of cases, which that's why I said don't be cruel, but do your job. If you're on your job in terms of the power that you are given and the limitations which are put on you, particularly with the statutes of this nature, please don't try to just expand and go around as if you are dealing with your own money. So likewise, if you put your jurisdiction in place and work, have a smile on your face and do your job with all the rigor that is required. I think this is one way of, putting that finality seal. At the same time, section 30, I think gives a lot of room, because even I'm an arbitrator, arbitrations are going on. We use this persuasive mode wherever it's possible. Why don't you at least, if there are 10 issues, 3 or 4 issues, why not you settle? Section 30 gives the room. There is no embargo. There's no exclusion of power or jurisdiction. This, I think, is a food for thought that I'm just putting across. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So can I have the closing comments of the panelists? I'll first take it to Mr. Ramesh Singh because there has been a reference to it. So how often do you use Section 30 and your closing comments relating to promoting arbitration and insurance, sir?
Yeah, see, just one thing before I come to 30, and this is something which a person, Dr. Saluja, who is essentially in this domain, has indicated a necessity of somebody with a domain experience who understands the nuances of a health insurance and things and so forth. So what I will suggest, I has already suggested you have to redo your arbitration clause. That's, I think, number two, when you redo that arbitration clause, if you can have a part in that arbitration agreement, saying the arbitrator will be appointed by a particular institution, and people have to agree to that institution which you people form. Because Section 11 itself talks about not going necessarily to the court, but to an institution. And that institution in turn can have these domain practice people, like somebody who's trained as under you, to be a part of that panel. Then I think what Dr. Saluja's indicated, she comes from this domain field, that will be addressed specific. So you'll have a person who has an expertise in this field, which are part of the institution panel. So this is the starting point. So you start at the right foot. I guess that's one suggestion I like to put. Apart from doing away with this, just confining to quantum your arbitration clause, you have to be, as I said, you have to cajole. Otherwise, people will go to consumer court. And consumer court, people can go irrespective of arbitration agreement, unfortunately. They can go to consumer court irrespective. Other commercial dispute, they may not be able to go because Section 8. But consumer court, the law stands today, even post amendment, they can go to consumer court irrespective. So you have to get this kind of indication. Yes, Section 30, I completely agree with Justice Radhakrishnan, completely agree with. I tried experiencing one matter, it failed, but for a reason, whatever it failed, I did try. But yes, I completely feel. Then again, that's something. What happens mostly, sir, and it's a personal experience. But it's in Delhi, the judges, in fact, do try even before referring the matter to an arbitrator. Sometimes they suspend the reference, the arbitrator entering upon reference for a few weeks, so that you kind of try and settle. Or sometimes they try to do that also before reference. So sometimes it's only when the things are not getting settled that the matter gets referred. Sometimes they do try in Section 11. So that effort is made. But yes, a second effort is not bad. You can always try a second effort when it comes to that. I completely agree. And I'll actually keep that in my mind to try that more often, whichever arbitration I'm doing, and at least try and indicate to people as well. Yes, that's all.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Can I have the last comment from Shri Arup Chatterji? Mr. Chatterji, can we have your closing comments?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
In terms of, we also conscious about the new also developing capacity and capability that I talk of the new landscape. This my mind, the cyber risk, the D&O type of claims will increase. Focus on ESG and green recovery post-pandemic. There will be more on measurement and sharing good data. Will be held accountable in they are to certify and vet some of the practices. Another area there would be lot for arbitration going forward, and this is because even in the inclusive insurance space, companies and others are involved. That is where a lot of youth will be coming in, but that performance has to be measured going forward. So, in addition to developing capacity, we also need to see how we can change the mindset and behavior so that increasingly the policy holders who have an information asymmetry problem, they have definitely less information than the insurance companies, how they can be incentivized to take recourse to arbitration. So that is one thing we also need to look at. Finally, in terms of arbitration is also an international opportunity for the Indian market. So how can India we made a Singapore-like destination where we can become a center for our international arbitration. So what are those things which Singapore did right and where we can further improve? Singapore, for example, announced tax breaks for arbitration practitioners. They waived the work permit requirements and things like that. Can we also do such things so that we don't only get train our local professionals, but we also get international talent and professionals to provide the cutting edge knowledge in different areas? Thank you.
Dr. Rashmi, your final word.
In fact, as everybody has just summed it up by saying there are two things which are very important in this particular aspect, and primarily in the healthcare sector, insurance sector is of course the trust, and the trust building awareness are two things which we really need to actually put it into a next level altogether. It has to be a holistic participation of, as I had mentioned earlier also, by the government, by the regulator, by the service provider, hospitals, doctors, and of course the insurance companies. And the insurance companies also will have to, along with the service providers, because I really feel any patient or any claimant understands and listens to the doctor far more than they would understand and listen the insurance company. So that kind of a bridge needs to be created in which they have to be told, and in fact the ecosystem for the arbitration has to be developed, which is technically sound, which understands very nascent district understanding of the medical education, which has the cutting edge technology. And the technology is one thing which need to actually try and be incorporated in all aspects of the insurance and the service providers, so that things become far more better. The protocols need to be set, and it cannot, it cannot be an arbitrary way of actually dealing with the claimant. And all the insurance companies also will have to work together in realizing a particular way how things can be worked upon along with the trained arbitrators. A lot of things, in fact, the things will depend on how well technically these arbitrators are going to be handling this particular situation. Unless and until like their trust and the technical education is next level, this is not going to go anywhere. So a lot of emphasis has to be made that the way the whole world became aware, scientifically more aware, medically more aware immediately after the pandemic, this needs to be also developed so that a particular way, a lot of monies are riding on this, a lot of health and lives are riding on this. So we should create a platform which is more understandable and more ecosystem friendly, where the service provider and the claimant should be, and their point of view should be understood very well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, madam, and thank you very much to the elite panel. And it's been a pleasure with interacting with you all. So firstly, thank you, Justice Radhakrishnan, for taking out time. So we had a slight technical hitch in terms of getting connected, but I am glad that you had the patience to stick on, and thank you very much for that. And I thank Shri Ramesh Singh for sharing his experience relating to this arbitration in practice. And I also thank Shri Arup Kumar Chatterji for sharing his views and bringing in the perspective of trying to adapt the international best practices to make arbitration work in insurance, which is more an information and a specialization domain rather than a general commercial domain. And I also thank Dr. Rashmi Saluja to bring into for the willingness to incorporate arbitration as one of the mechanisms for dealing with it. And that is the battle that we are trying to fight on two counts. One, in terms of building the capacity in terms of the personnel who can handle this. The second is in terms of persuading and pursuing with one, the insurance companies, and two, the regulators in terms of making arbitration as a more preferred option in spite of the customer having the option of going to a consumer forum, as Shri Raman Singh has indicated. Ramesh Singh as indicated. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to interact with you
Dr.
all. and
Dr.
with you.
Mallikarjun, Dr.
Yes.
Mallikarjun, can we
Yes.
have take a few questions given by the participants?
Yes.
It's on the chat.
Yes.
There are a few questions given by the participants for the panelists on the chat. Can we have that? Dr. Mallikarjun.
This question I'll address to Justice Radhakrishnan. Whether further amendments in arbitration is needed, especially in insurance, so that litigants can use arbitration easily. So I would like to get your views on it, sir. You're on mute, sir.
Okay, sorry. Any particular amendment that is proposed to arbitration law, particularly to ensure that it reaches out to the needy, they have to be fundamentally proactive, and it should be an easily accessible tool. And one huge drawback, which I have often visualized in India, very sadly, is that we propose. Now the question, let us take the question is a proposal, and I am seconding it. You need to have a change. But when does it happen in India? With great respect to our great nation, with our legislative mechanism, the time-consuming mechanism. It takes nothing less than 8 to 10 years to translate this idea into action. And that 8 to 10 years space bar actually takes off the fulcrum of the present suggestion. By the time the world over, changes would have happened at such speed that you will be lagging back again by 20 years. That's the whole issue we have, not merely in this procedural law of arbitration or the technicality of arbitration law and reaching out to people to make it more proactive in the insurance sector, but every sector I'm saying, whether it is the civil code amendments, whatever, because that's not an acquisition as such. That is how the system works. But nonetheless, if there is a proactive method, I would definitely suggest that the proposal for such amendments need not always come from a Law Commission of India, which I don't know whether it is now functional or not, the way we see things. I can see the smile on Mr. Ramesh Singh's face. Well, you need to push. That's where the problem, you need to push. Now, the whole debate now have seen two different zones. One is the pre-corona period and one is the post-corona period. Assume that we go to a third stage, and by the time the insurance amendment does not come through, what we are now visualizing. I would definitely say that if you can find out ways and means of easing the system through appropriate amendments, and also like just taking a leaf from what Mr. Ramesh Singh said, even the Act can say that while choosing the arbitrator, even now there are provisions in the Act which indicate that while choosing the arbitrator to be put on a compulsive mode by the judicial sector, the judges should have the pick and choose, should be having in mind persons who can really decide on issues. We have provisions in the Act which say that you can call for expert opinion, experts and all those things, incorporate experts. But how far on the practical side in India this is happening? I'm not, when I make that comment, it is not exclusively on your medical negligence or medical insurance sector, but on the whole, how far it is going on. So therefore, if you can make it more, statute can be made bullet point specific so that the judges can't just, when I say the judges, everybody for that matter who are involved, even the arbitrators, we can't just, do that running around. So then you need to structure it. So adjudicators have to adjudicate in terms of the laws, unless of course you are working on a constitutional frame in a different modality of adjudication. But here I often find this. I've come across excellent judges sitting as one subject, which obviously the insurers will definitely know, is the motor accidents claims tribunals, where insurance actually coughs up a lot of money. And I've seen judges sitting in the motor accidents claims tribunal who could decide matters more precisely than many of the persons who come as experts. Why? Because they burn the midnight oil to learn the subject and come to the point. But if such effort can't be taken, necessarily you will have to provide what you have, like in the MACT, you have a schedule. If you break a toe, so much. If you break your finger, so much. Likewise, you can't do that in this sector, but nonetheless, the Act can be amended in a very proactive way, but without creating more confusions. This is something that happens. So let us try and suggest something very concrete, which can be pushed through. And if it appeals, obviously, I think under the present legislative climate in India, there's a likelihood of good things being accepted, notwithstanding that the Law Commission is not fully functional. This is why we are seeing some of the amendments that are now being rolled out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. There is another question, but he has chosen to ignore the question. So since we are running out of time, thank you very much. So I would like to close this panel discussion with this. And once again, I thank Justice Radhakrishnan, Shri Arup Chatterji, Dr. Rashmi, and Mr. Ramesh Singh for sparing their valuable time, sharing their views, and also enhancing the knowledge and information through your experience sharing. Thank you very much, sir. It's been a pleasure to have you all. Thank you. Thank you, sir.